In this video, we introduce the two most commonly thought ways that John's prologue is structured, and then I offer some final thoughts on whether I think one or the other is better and how we might sort of approach the prologue. We ended the last video on outlining text by you practicing doing some outlining of your own of the Lord's Prayer. I want you to go ahead and pause here. We're going to start this video and we're going to use this later on in the video. So I really strongly encourage you to actually pause and do the lecture pause here. Pause the video, turn to John 1, 1 through 18, or print out John 1, 1 through 18, and write up an outline. Remember, we're doing I suggest doing a two-level outline where you don't have a subpoint unless you have a second subpoint. So you always have at least two items as our method for outlining. So go ahead, and this will probably take you a little while, maybe 10 to 15 minutes, to create an outline that we'll use in this video, and we'll compare to two other ways that the prologue has been structured. All right, now that you have your outline in hand, no doubt, I'm going to show you the two different ways that the prologue of the Gospel of John has typically or is typically thought to be structured. So the first one, and the one that sort of continues to show to be influential whether or not one accepts the structure, is from Raymond Brown in his Anchor Bible commentary, which some of you I know are engaging for as your optional commentary for this class. And he engages in a strophic way, that is to say in sort of poetic sections. So he sees let's see, I think it's 4 or 5 different strophes here. We'll see when they come up. The first one as John 1, 1 through 2, the Word being with God. So we sort of have the introduction of the Word here. And then we have the Word moving into creation, or the Word's relationship to creation. And what Raymond Brown's sort of innovation, or what his influence is here, is to see different parentheses added into these strophes. So he sees John 1, 6 through 9 as a parenthesis, that is to say, sort of aside from the poetic structure, or a break away from the poetic structure. And in that break from the poetic structure, John the Baptist witnesses to Jesus's authority. And then moving out of the parenthesis, we come back to the third strophe, which is about the Word in the world. And then the fourth strophe also has a parenthesis after it. So the fourth strophe is about the community's share in the Word, and then John witnesses again. So we have this repetition of John. And then our fourth strophe again, excuse me, I'm trying to mentally realize why I have this twice, is because we have John 1:14 as the first part of the fourth strophe, and then John 1:15 is the parenthesis that's stuck in, and then the fourth strophe continues in John 1:16, continuing to talk about the community's share in the Word. And so what this does for Brown is it allows him to construct what was the original hymn and what was the later additions, or the later parentheses that were added in. So for Brown, the original hymn is going to consist of these 4 strophes with some verses taken out. And I want to show you what that looks like. And I'll read it out loud to you so you can get a sense here of the poetic structure with those parentheses that are taken out. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and with him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. From his fullness, we all have received grace upon grace. And you can see how when you sort of take out these parentheses, there is a little bit more elegance to the poetic structure here. There's a bit more flow when you take out these other sections that are more sort of parenthetical information or clarifications. And so for Raymond Brown, which one of these is he going to be focused on, the text history or the text? So which approach is he going to take? And see if you can go ahead and name that approach. That's right. It's going to be a diachronic approach to the world of the text, focusing on the text history in order to understand the text better. So he's really sort of interested in the sources that are being used and edited, sort of doing source and redaction criticism to the original hymn. And there are positives and negatives to thinking about a hymn source for John 1 and for dividing out the prologue the way that Raymond Brown does. As I've said, it really sort of highlights the poetic nature. You can really see how beautifully poetic the prologue is when you take out some of those parentheses and those clarifications that are a little bit less poetic and a little bit less beautiful. You can also really see how these bits about John the Baptist in particular feel like intrusions. They feel like the author or the editor is really trying to communicate something about John the Baptist that doesn't seem to quite fit with the poetic nature of the rest of the prologue. It makes it easier for us to see the source material and the later clarification, so we can see those intrusions really clearly, and it gives us a sense of sort of maybe what at different points in time the people or the audience that used this text, this hymn, what they valued and what later people valued, or what a later editor might have valued. So in this way, it sort of informs the world behind the text. And Raymond Brown, as we've mentioned in other previous videos, is one who is going to see sort of different phases of the Johannine community at work, or that the gospel, the fourth gospel, is developing over time based on different social and historical circumstances that the movement is facing. You can sort of see this very clearly, or Brown can see this very clearly in the prologue here. He can say that, this original was hymn was used sort of as devotion to Jesus, and then later on there seemed to be maybe some conflict with or some questions about John the Baptist's authority, and at a later point in time someone really wanted to make sure that Jesus was propped up above John the Baptist. So you can really see how the sort of world behind the text might be working its way into the text itself with this approach. The sort of drawbacks to this approach is we have absolutely no source evidence to suggest that we have different developments of this hymn, or that we had an original hymn that was later added to. So there is no cases of John chapter 1 that don't have those intrusions about John the Baptist. So in this way, this is sort of a speculative endeavor. It's looking at the final form of the text and cutting things out based on the fact that we think, or Raymond Brown thinks, that they feel like intrusion. So there's no sort of hard and fast evidence. And it also privileges one part of the text over the other part of the text. It sort of implies that the original hymn is more important than those things that were added in later, which is, generally speaking, for most of us, sort of, we want to take a more holistic approach that doesn't necessarily favor one part over another. So the other way that the text might be constructed, the prologue might be constructed, is in a chiastic structure. So this slide here is a callback to that video on chiasms, where we explained what a chiasm is, how it functions. Remember, sort of with a chiasm, we have everything coming down to a center point, to one focal point that tends to be the most important thing, but it also, a chiastic structure sort of produces an elegance to the text that is poetic. And so I'm going to show you two different ways that the prologue has been constructed chiastically, or how sort of the chiastic structure has been put on to the prologue. The first is going to come from R.A. Culpepper, and this is sort of the most influential one, the one that has sort of received the most traction. And his is very, very detailed. He finds at the center of the chiasm, becoming children of God. So what is the focal point for Culpepper is going to be children of God. This is going to be the thing that is most important about the prologue. And then moving out from here, we can see some parallels. Receiving him, namely Jesus, and believing him. So here we have two similar ideas. They're not going to be the exact same verb, but the object of the verb, namely Jesus, is going to be the same in both cases. His own do not receive him, and his own are born of God. So again, different verbs, but this time the same subject. His own are born of God, and his own did not receive him. The light is in the world, and the word became flesh in the world. So again, different names for Jesus, or different symbols for Jesus, as in light and word. But the similarity here is being in the world, or entering into the world. With D and D prime, we have John, John sent from God to testify, and then in D prime, some information about John's testimony. And then with A, B, and C, this is where I think personally that we have more of a stretch, that things start to unravel a little bit at the outside edges. I think that there's a better case for this in here being sort of chiastically structured, but I'm not as convinced for the outside part. So with C and C prime, we have light and light in the darkness, and we have gift upon gift. So I guess the idea here is that we have two positive things, but though in very, very different words. In B and B prime, we have what came to be through the word and the gift of truth that is in Jesus Christ. So something sort of happens by means of Jesus, though using different symbols again for Jesus. In one case, Jesus' actual name in B prime, the bottom one, and the word through the word in B. And then finally, with 1, 1, and 2, we have the word in the beginning with God and the Son revealing the Father. So we have a relationship between Jesus and the Father in both of these, again, though, with different terms. With A, it's the Word and God, and with A prime, it's the Son and the Father. So another individual has taken sort of the nuts and bolts, or the basic outline of Culpepper's chiasm here, and simplified it a little bit. This is Jeffrey Staley's, and his, you'll see, it only goes down to D. So it's going to be a little bit more generalized. And once again, just like Culpepper, he is going to have becoming children of God be the center of the chiasm. Working out, we have this bit about journeying. So either the light's journey or the word's journey, ultimately the same individual, namely Jesus, in different terms, but it's about where they go and what they do, entering and leaving places, journeying in places. And then we have the parallel between John witnessing, Jesus being really put up above John, and then we have this sort of rather than, whereas Culpepper has Jesus and God, or the Word and the Father, Staley is going to have the Word, God, creation, and humanity. And once again, we start to get a little bit more of a stretch at the end, insofar as in A, we do have creation, in A prime down here, excuse me, I don't have the primes on B and A. In A prime down here, we do not have creation repeated explicitly. So we do have sort of this trifecta of the Word, God, and humanity, Jesus, God, and humanity, with creation missing. So the positives and negatives of seeing the chiasm in John chapter 1. So on the positive side is it shows that there is sort of a care and a poetic way that the prologue has been constructed. And I think that is something that we should take away from the prologue, that no doubt it is poetic, and no doubt it has been carefully constructed, with much intention, that the author really intends something, a very particular purpose for the prologue. And there is a lot of parallelism in John chapter 1, and particularly in the prologue. So we do have a number of repeated themes. If you were to do a close reading of the text and mark repeated themes in different colors, your paper would probably light up like a Christmas tree. You'd have all kinds of different colors on here, because you do have lots of things repeated, lots of different parallelisms. The question is, are those parallelisms organized together in a particular way? If it is chiastic, this really helps us understand what the prologue is doing, and it really informs sort of how we think about the entire gospel. So if we accept either Staley's or Culpepper's chiastic structure, the emphasis is really on the children of God and becoming children of God. And that sort of then becomes a lens by which we can read the entire gospel, thinking about how the gospel serves to to encourage one to believe and to become a child of God, or to enter the fold of the children of God. And so it really, this way of thinking about the structure really centers the prologue on that central point and gives us an interpretive key, not just for the prologue, but perhaps for the entirety of the Gospel of John. On the negative side is that if John is in fact using an existing source, so if we do in fact have a hymn that is sort of added to, or that we have parenthetical information or clarifications added in, then it becomes a lot harder to sort of make the chiasm out of that existing source. You have to do more cutting, more rearranging in order to make something that's not chiastic into a chiasm. And as I mentioned several times, the parallelism to me, especially at the beginning and the end, isn't always clear and convincing. And the last point, I think perhaps the most important in my mind, is that there are many different themes from the fourth gospel that show up in the prologue and that are sort of introduced in the prologue. And I think focusing in on the children of God is maybe not the interpretive key that I would want to look for. Maybe it's not the interpretive key that we are looking for. Certainly, being children of God is an important theme throughout the Gospel of John, but I don't think it's necessarily the most important theme. I think it is one important theme among many other important themes. So I think to focus on that theme, or to see that as the interpretive key, is to do a little bit too much, is to sort of, as often happens with chiasms, is to force the structure on the text and then try and make a mountain out of a molehill, in a sense. And I'm a little bit skeptical about doing that kind of thing. So we're going to move in our final portion of the video here back to your outline. So I'll invite you now to go ahead and grab your outline, and I'm going to show you how I outline the prologue of John. And this is not to suggest that this is the outline that is the correct outline. As we mentioned in the outlining video, outlining, like exegesis, is an art and a science. There is precision to it, but at the same time, each person is going to produce a different outline. And the real purpose of the outline is to help you in the process of interpretation, to see new things in the text. And so I want to show you my outline just so that you have a point of comparison for yours. And so that then we can move to some takeaways about the prologue based on this outline and based on the observations about the perhaps chiastic structure of the prologue and the perhaps strophic structure of the prologue. So I see the prologue really doing sort of three movements. In these first 5 verses, we have the word being introduced, and the word being introduced with respect to particularly important Johannine themes and ideas, namely creation, life, and light, which are going to show up again and again throughout the gospel. In the second move, we do have this, what I am convinced is somewhat intrusive material about John the Baptist. It doesn't follow the same poetic structure. And the section really serves to make clear that John the Baptist is not the light. John the Baptist is not the word. John the Baptist is lower than Jesus. And I do think that reflects something going on with the Johannine community and the sort of broader Jewish world in which John the Baptist's circle was influential in the first century. And then in this third movement, we have this bit about entering the world or journeying. So the light comes in the world, is rejected by the world, but is accepted by those who will become children of God. And by that happening, we have this glory revealed. So once again, many of the important Johannine themes show up in this third movement of the prologue. The world, rejection by the world, acceptance, children of God, and glory. And I should say here, I give us our previous and our following context. There is no previous context insofar as this as the beginning of the text. And in that way, there is an importance to that. The way a text begins does have, it does sort of change the entire experience of the text. And that's why I think many of these Johannine themes are being introduced in the prologue so that they can be developed later on. And in the following context, we see once again John the Baptist really making clear that he is not the Messiah. So what comes next sort of has already made its way up into the prologue a little bit in verses 6 through 8. So to take us out here, I want to give you sort of my take on the prologue based on the two main options, or the two primary ways that the text gets structured, and then move us to an sort of an exegetical summary of the prologue. So I do absolutely think that John 1 through 18 is poetic, and I do think it is strophic. That is to say, I do think it advances sort of in sections rather than in sort of more microscopic bits as the chiastic structure would have it. So from Raymond Brown's take on the passage, I do see more of this sort of section by section movement. But deferring from Brown's position, while I do think that some of these sources appear to be intrusions, sort of focusing in on that and trying to determine the different strata of how these sources came together and how they were edited, I think that is ultimately distracting from appreciating the prologue's beauty. It's okay to recognize it, but to focus in sort of on this source critical way of doing things is a little bit distracting from the overall beauty of the prologue. The prologue contains much parallelisms, and this is why our close reading or our marking of the passage would light up, because we have so many different Johannine themes, or themes from the fourth gospel, that are being introduced. And I think this is very much an intentional move, that the prologue was probably written after the gospel itself was written, and these themes from the gospel are being intentionally introduced early on in order to set up the audience's experiences of the entire gospel. If you think about your own writing of a paper, in theory, you should be writing your introduction last and sort of priming your reader for what they will experience, the themes and ideas that will be raised within the paper. And I think that's what the prologue is doing, that all of these Johannine themes are in there in order that the audience can sort of be ready for their development throughout the rest of the gospel. And I don't think that one particular theme or idea is being privileged over and against the others in the prologue, that sort of all of these have essentially equal weight. So I would not take from the chiastic structure this idea that the children of God is what stands center in the prologue. All right, so to take us out, I want you to do something, and then I am going to do something. I want you to quickly reread the prologue, and I want you to write an exegetical summary on John 1 through 18 on the basis of that rereading, of the outline you've constructed, and on the information that I've given you in this video. You've probably heard me say before that writing an exegetical summary, or summarizing a passage, is one, a very important task, but two, a very difficult task. So the more practice you can get trying to summarize thoughts about exegesis and thoughts about the passage, the more you can do that, the better. So I invite you to go ahead and pause. Go ahead and do this, and then I will give you my exegetical summary of John 1 through 18. All right, so here is what I have to say. John 1 through 18 is a poetic prologue that, using a strophic structure, introduces several themes that reappear throughout the fourth gospel. Life, light opposed to darkness, the superiority of Jesus to John the Baptist, Jesus' entrance into the world's opposition to Jesus, being children of God, born from above, and the close relationship between Jesus the Son and God the Father.